Young people have dreams and hopes for their future, and every parent can agree that what they want for their children is to be future ready, to have the skills and opportunities they will need to succeed in the future. Yet innovation is transforming the way we work and bringing into question how educators and schools can best prepare students given the uncertain future of work. The world of work is rapidly changing, and most of the jobs that will exist in 20 years haven't even been created yet. It's impossible to know the science and technological skills students will need to succeed in the future. Also, a point on entrepreneurship. There is a growing interest among youth, and it requires a different set of skills. What we know, including from business leaders and employers, is that to succeed in the future, students will need skills to set and achieve goals, skills to manage emotions in the face of uncertainty and challenge, skills to identify and build relationships with good mentors who can help them succeed when work changes, skills to understand the needs of others, including supervisors, clients, and customers, and to show respect for others from different backgrounds, skills to communicate and collaborate with others from diverse backgrounds and fields. All of these competencies are what social and emotional learning is designed to teach. The most universal employability skills are interpersonal ones: communication, self-awareness, personal management, and being able to work with and get along with others. These are the same skills taught in quality SEL lessons and programs. In fact, employers say they can teach new hires relevant science and technology, but what they can't teach and often struggle to find are the foundational skills that social and emotional skills students will need for success. I am excited to introduce our new 5-part webisode series on this topic. In 2020, CASEL launched an initiative to strategically integrate social and emotional learning with career and workforce development. In partnership with 8 states, Delaware, Kansas, Nevada, North Dakota, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Utah, and Wisconsin, and the generous support of Pure Edge, Inc., we are identifying and elevating policies to address inequities in youth employment and engage in an economic revival.
We need the students and the families to start driving this process. And so it isn't that we are trying to get away from the school counselor sitting down one-on-one. First of all, we want to do it in groups. We want to do it in teams. What the individual plan of study, or what we call nationally the individualized learning plans, what it does is it helps the student come to the realization of why I need to really embrace those structures. We build these great career pathways and we forget to tell students why it's important. So it's really, it's a discovery process that allows the student to realize their potential and all of the different things that they can do. So one quick story, young woman in Wisconsin who as a sophomore was doing nothing. So first generation college student, Latina, low income background. So all the different demographics, it says, you know, the student, we would call her in a high need kind of category. So sophomore year, she gets exposed to the health pathway, right? This whole new health careers and all these wonderful things. Because she knew how to use the online system, and you heard in Kansas, they're using Zello. There's actually lots of different systems into careers and Naviance and lots of different names. But she had access to one of these systems. And for 2 years, had been learning how to use it. So when she saw this exciting thing called hospitals and saw this really cool thing of different opportunities, she went on her own and found that she could get a dietitian aid certificate that summer, which she did. Starting to work in the hospital, she got really excited and realized there's other things she can do. She came back in the fall term, started taking all the advanced science and math classes she could take, and then went and got 10 credits of early college. So she's starting at the bottom third of her class, right? She's not growing her GPA up tremendously, but her letter of statement for going to college looks a lot different than the average student. And in fact, she got a 4-year scholarship to a nursing school.
Welcome to our 4th installment of our Webisode series on integrating social emotional learning with career and workforce development to ensure all students are future ready. This series is supported by a group of resources to include a groundbreaking policy roadmap on these integration points and 3 separate case studies on states that are really leading the way in innovation. One such state joins us today, and that's the great state of Kansas. In that case study, and of course in this webisode, you'll hear about the practical intersections between career advising and social emotional learning. And one example of that is the individualized learning plan process. In Kansas, we refer to that as individual plans of study. It's called many things in different states, but this intersection really offers a framework for social emotional learning informed advising. And based on the leadership skills of Kent Reed, who joins us today in his work in leading school counseling in Kansas, and our dear friend, Stacy Smith, who is the Assistant Director for Career Standards and Assessment Services. We know that we have much to share with you. Stacy's leadership really typifies how to work collaboratively by providing leadership for continuous improvement of all education systems to ensure and enhance learning for all Kansas students. Through his leadership, we have really tangible policy to practice measures to look at and study, which are all again exemplified in this case study, not the least of which is the STAR recognition system and other well-integrated supports that offer a policy framework for practitioners in the field in Kansas. Stacy, I'm going to ask if you would mind introducing your colleague, Kent Reed.
Yeah, it's my pleasure to introduce Kent. He's the foundation that our school counselors rely upon for wisdom, best practices, and he intersects with the legislature around some of the key aspects of mental health, the Jason Flatt Act, a lot of the very crucial supports that go out to support climate and culture in schools. As a foundational level so that they can reach some of the aspirational goals that we strive for in the state. So it's been a pleasure to learn from Kent over the last 6 years and try to help support him as he does this work. Thank you, Stacy. That was very kind.
Well, I know from the both of you that you both in your own right liaise with the Kansas State Board, particularly in the implementation of SECD standards as a foundational component of the Kansas Can vision. Now, the Kansas Can mission tells us that Kansas is leading the world in the success of each student and depends upon the empowerment of student capacity in the pursuit of the high school diploma. Love that. The mission goes on to talk about individualized student learning experiences coupled with collaborative exploration involving school staff, family, and community. So need I say more about the alignment of Kansas Can with the CASEL framework? Can you give us a little bit of a backdrop on Kansas Can?
Well, 8 years ago, Dr. Randy Watson became our commissioner, and he and at the time, the deputy commissioner did a series of focus groups across the state of Kansas, one focusing on just general community members and another set focusing on business and industry. The idea was that those that attended those focus groups, they were asked what set of characteristics would be most successful for their kids, their students. And 70% of the general community said that non-academic skills were the most important for us to focus on. And then I think this was really a surprise at the time. It hasn't been since, but at the time, 81% of business and industry attendees said that non-academic skills were the most important. And what we're talking about that there are employability skills and customer service skills. So the state board took that data, crunched it, and they came up with these goals. And if you look at them, social emotional growth, kindergarten readiness, individual plan of study, high school graduation rates, and post-secondary completion, all of them relate in one fashion or another to social emotional learning or the individual plan of study. Now, here are our SECD standards, and in Kansas, we call them social emotional character development standards. We were the second state to adopt SEL standards behind the great work that Ruth Cross at CASEL did in Illinois. But we were the first state to embed character education into those SEL standards. And I would like to point your direction to the standard character development. Within that standard, we have core principles. And those core principles include mandates from the legislature. For example, Stacy alluded to the fact that we're a flat act state, that's suicidal ideation. We have a bullying prevention statute that schools need to follow. Aaron's Law has been discussed. The way we address Aaron's Law, which is child sexual abuse, is to incorporate those principles into our mandated reporting statute. And the IPS is a core principle for all schools. Then the other two standards, social development and personal development, you can see how that relates to employability and the IPS.
You talked about the core principles, and one of the things I think is so unique to Kansas is this real intentionality around nurturing and encouraging school districts to develop their own core principles, right, based on their knowledge of the community, right? That is a level of community engagement relative to establishing principles and standards and instructional approaches that is rarely seen. Can you describe a little bit about how that came about and how that's nurtured in the state?
We are a local option state. And traditionally, historically, the Kansans are pretty independent. Now, what we can provide them are examples of what works for others, best practices, et cetera. And when we first started out, of course, we wouldn't be here without the great work of CASEL, because we have utilized CASEL and the resources and the personnel that you guys have. And we're very fortunate to have that partnership. But the bottom line relative to what is important to each school district lies within each school district. They understand what their needs are. We ask them to do needs assessments in a variety of different areas, including career, academic, and social emotional. And then we provide them with some guiding principles as well as the standards and best practices from other areas. And we have developed within Kansas some best practices that we'll talk about in a moment.
Yeah, fabulous. One of those best practices is around the individual plan of study. So let's talk through that, and then we can get more into the competency sequence and then the IPS.
Right. Early on, and we're talking about, in the 2008, 2009 timeframe, research collaboration at the University of Kansas came up with what they called a competency framework. And that aligned very well with our standards, although there's some difference. They refer to intra and inter. We refer to social and personal. But nevertheless, the idea is if you look at our standards, the student indicators are actually student competencies. And Dr. Patty Noonan and Dr. Amy Gomer Erickson at KU developed their framework, and we have kind of taken that to the next level. We have a contract with them to provide that public or that professional development to Kansas schools around the framework. Now, the neat thing about their model is that early on, there was a lot of criticism from academicians because we didn't really take a look at the cognitive aspect of social emotional learning. And Amy and Patty solved that problem for us. And when we talk about the cognitive side of social emotional, we're talking about creative thinking, time management, learning schematics, critical thinking, et cetera. So that's a very important piece of social emotional learning and very important piece to academicians as well.
Appreciate that so much. And I can see the hallmarks of the competencies and skills of social emotional learning all over this. And I take this as a nod toward life skills or real world skills for life, right? Like these skills are built up in an employment setting. Absolutely. These are the skills that keep us in our career trajectory and in our life goals in good stead. And I just love how they're sequenced in a developmental way, organized through this particular framework. Can you walk us through this sequence?
Sure. These are the 6 competencies that Amy and Patty have identified as being the most utilized and most frequently asked for. And keep in mind that these competencies, when you look at self-regulation and self-efficacy, that also morphs into student management. And so that was a buy-in for administrators as well. And so what we were able to do is come up with an intersection of a variety of different domains with the competency framework. What you're seeing on your screen is an example of the sequential curriculum that Amy and Patty provide schools that ask for it, and it is pre-K through 12. Now the screenshot just shows pre-K and K2, but it does go all the way through 12th grade. And again, it focuses on those 6 competencies that we have the most research on and that are most frequently asked for.
Building on this sequence and understanding, particularly as students move through career awareness into career exploration and then ultimately some post-secondary planning, Kansas adopted the Individual Plan of Study, or APS, in 2014. I'm curious about how that process came about and how it's been adapted to explicitly integrate social emotional learning.
It has been, a major focus of 5 years worth of our work. And so the board vision and that development just aligned really well with the reauthorization of Perkins 5 and the emphasis that legislation places on work-based learning. And so pulling together our academic and career planning through the IPS and then tying that into some of our work-based learning efforts really brought multiple things together. And the sequence of competency development around those core aspects of interpersonal, intrapersonal, and cognitive growth and development are at the heart of the CTE Sunflower, which we didn't include in our slides, but in the CTE world, we talk about applied knowledge, we talk about effective relationships, we talk about workplace skills, and they're built into the competencies that came out of the state career clusters and then have been integrated into courses in the CTE world. So that might be a little bit granular, enough to get lost in the weeds in the conversation, but we've had a big push around the individual plan of study and incorporating the social emotional growth and development of students. And I think one of the next slides that Kent will bring up and discuss will be the alignment between our social emotional competencies and the employability skills language that, when we talked to the Kansas Department of Commerce, they said, a lot of your literature is just really not the language that we use in the workplace. And if you want business and industry to provide you feedback upon student behaviors, we've got to align that language a little bit so that the layman can participate. We have some pretty strong goals around CTE participation, making experiences in the real world and real world learning available to students. Try to scale up internships, client connected learning, and some of those kinds of experience where students can put their academic and technical skills into play, but they can do that with a mentor. They can do that with, as Dr. Solberg would call them, a caring and encouraging adult who can provide feedback and mentoring.
100%. I'm so glad that you reminded us in this conversation about the value of mentors and also the value of common language, which we see in this policy roadmap. I want to come back to the digital reference guide, which is the slide here, but I think this is a great point in the conversation on having that shared sort of set of agreed upon phrases, statements, being very explicit about how social emotional learning shows up within this continuum. I want to share this slide first, and then we can talk more about the IPS framework. So Ken, this question is for you. What aspects of social emotional learning are showing up here, and which ones would you point to as absolutely essential for states?
Well, what this slide represents is a crosswalk between the federal CTE indicators and our Kansas Can Competency framework, as well as our social emotional character development standards. And you can see there's a complete alignment between the federal indicators, the competency framework, as well as the SECD standards. And so they all kind of converge together. And later on, I'll show you a slide of what that looks like in school counseling as well. But the idea is to not work harder, but to work smarter. And if we can address social emotional competencies along with career development, then why not do that?
100%, totally agree with that. And I think this next graphic sort of demonstrates that. Like, here we are on the journey, right? Trying to make that explicit connection and leveraging social emotional learning for each and every child as a lever for their individualized success. So talk to me a little bit about strengthening the IPS and working with folks to honor, as you said, local control with school districts and schools and communities.
The framework and the alignment of those skills and competencies, I guess it maybe places it in a different context if we talk about the portfolio requirements that Kansas has for the individual plan of study. And so part of the state board mandate is that every student have an individual plan of study. And we define an individual plan of study as a process and product, and among other things, that each student have an electronic portfolio that shows their holistic growth and development. And so those mentor feedback forms provide another layer in that portfolio. So the student self-evaluation, their instructor's evaluation, or the counselor's evaluation, in addition to that community project or that mentor experience. So there's multiple ways for them to receive feedback around growth and development and the attainment of those competencies. So, our work-based learning efforts have recognized career awareness beginning, in kindergarten, second grade, and it aligns with the American School Counselors' goals and competencies for mindsets and behaviors that students begin to develop, and that increases their ability to make the next tier of decisions as they begin to develop their career identity. And formally, our individual plan of study begins in the middle school. And again, that's a local option of whether they want to identify the middle grades as 6th grade through 8th grade. If they think they have the ability in that school district to formally begin the IPS at age 12 or age 14, we let them make that determination about their resources and abilities. But more and more our schools are leaning towards pretty sophisticated plans at the 5th grade and 6th grade level, particularly where they're trying to do something around the implementation of computer sciences and exposing students to what that career might look like and where they might see others like themselves in that career, so they can consider it an option. But our professional learning networks have been pivotal in getting information to various regions across the state. We've got 4 trainers right now that are running distance cohorts. They do that through Zoom, and they're able to, set aside an hour once a month to be able to share in their PLC, best practices. This has been really important for our frontier communities in Western Kansas that are somewhat isolated and don't really get the opportunity to get together in convenings and share ideas as much, particularly while we're going through what would be called a substitute teaching crisis, where it's been very, very hard post-pandemic to find retired educators who are willing to come back or people that are certified. So it's hard to get a counselor out of the building, and it's a lot easier to have that virtual IPS professional learning network come to them.
100%. Yeah.
We've seen some great growth around practices and strategies to support the implementation in the schools.
As Stacy suggested, which was a great segue into some of the tools that we have developed to address implementation of the IPS. And one of them is the digital reference guide for IPS. It is a one-stop shop opportunity for schools to understand how to implement what the IPS is, first of all, and how to implement it. And then we cover a myriad of career-related things in it, such as our career advising model. You will find in the reference guide, employability skills and how to implement strategies for employability, and also the competency framework is in there as well. So it is really a handy tool. And the PLNs have been using this digital reference guide since we developed it.
Just want to point out that links to the digital reference guide and all of the resources that we've spotlighted in the conversation so far are all linked and featured within the Kansas case study as well. So appreciate CCD and the gentleman on this call today for being really collaborative in the development of that case study. I'm going to push ahead to talk more specifically about how the work-based learning plan shows up in the digital reference guide, and then how the IPS shows up in the digital reference guide, and how you really see that as a resource for folks in the field, for school districts, for schools. How are they using these tools in practice?
For example, the work-based learning digital reference guide is a great encyclopedia. There's links within it that you can dig into. Is this safe enough to try? Let's do this for our kids. We want to make this possible, but you don't want to skip past the Fair Labor Standards Act and what the implementation of the work-based learning program looks like. And so if anything else, this gives a pacing to school districts for the conversations that they need to have internally as they consult their policies, look at best practices in other schools around them, and explore, is this safe to do for our kids? Do we have liability coverage before we take this next step?
We would like to share a credit. Natalie Clark, who was with the agency for a long time, spent a lot of hours, and Barb Bain as well, putting both of these reference guides together, and it was pure genius on their part. So we certainly did appreciate that. The other thing is that what we include in both the IPS digital reference guide and also the work-based learning digital reference guide is how to measure these, because measurement is part of accountability. And in Kansas, our focus on accountability is through our accreditation process. Okay, our CASEL process. And Natalie and I and Stacy were able to blend that concept into both of these reference guides, how to measure employability, how to measure the IPS. And that was really important for schools.
I know that the state has developed a lot of guidance, to your point, honoring what is germane and valuable for a local community context. But then also really lacing in evidence-based practices, high quality supportive examples, so that schools and school districts are able to make some of these decisions on their own. Tell me a little bit about what lessons you might share in that process, particularly with the networks that connect to rural LEAs, some of the frontier communities. Tell me a little bit about what that process looks like. So if there's a state that wants to replicate or adapt some of these great tools and resources, they have a bit of a story around that.
So this is from Piper School District, a little bit of a shout out to them for the great work that they've done. But as you put together compliance and accountability and all of the things that go around that, you don't want to restrict a school so much that they don't have their vision and they can't express it. And so the portrait of a graduate has been created throughout several school districts, and I think Piper's is pretty exemplary of taking those board goals and then putting them into action and looking over at the social, global, and cross-cultural skills that students in Piper can grow and develop. This surpasses compliance and accountability, right? I mean, they've decided how they're going to put this work into action, and it is student-centered. And so their goals become, supporting that success of each student. And that's one of the things about the work in Kansas school districts that I'm really proud of, is they supersede our expectations in a lot of ways, and blow right past the bars that we've set for them.
I love this notion that we have a specific example from a school district. Thank you, Piper, and other school districts within the state. So I want to come back to this notion of, if I don't know where to start, right? So I might be a state that is really strong in work-based learning practices. I might be a state that's strong in social emotional learning competencies and standards and practices. I might be strong in both, but just in our final 2 minutes, what would you suggest is a good starting point if I want to enter into a similar journey as Kansas has?
We would suggest is you start with our standards, which would be the SECD standards. But what you're seeing on your screen is an example of the Kansas school counseling standards. And you'll see that the 3 domains are the academic, career, and the social emotional. But where those intersect, where they overlap, those are the employability skills that we've been talking about with the competency framework. So by taking your standards, taking the competency framework, go to your staff and say, okay, these are the skills that we think we need to address. And I think family engagement is important as well. I think if you talk to families like we did through the community conversations, families will tell you the same thing, that they want their kids to be safe at school, but they want their kids to be prepared for that next step, whatever it might be, whether it's middle school or post-secondary or first grade. And all of the things that we've talked about, including the career domain, is relevant to those wishes.
Absolutely. I think we can definitely agree that the essential skills is what emerge here, those real world skills that can be applied across an academic setting, a career setting, and the trajectory of an individual lifespan. Because social emotional learning is happening at every point in our human experience, to include the workplace. So delighted that Kansas understands that. I'm going to ask each of you individually to perhaps give a final word before I wrap up this webisode for today.
I think it's pretty important to not be deficit driven when you're entering into the discussion. So there are pockets of this everywhere, literally in the school as you're walking past the classroom. So I mean, if you need to pull together your ag teacher to look at the FFA model, I mean, it aligns. Pull out your FBLA instructors, and then seek to expand that into your STEM spaces, which might not have the same CTSO support, but it is pulling together the academic and these opportunity-rich experiences that can inform the process. And it's multiple partners. This shouldn't be the work of one person. It's got to be the convening of a team, if not a community, a whole school approach. So
love that. That reminds me of the value of breaking down silos. Kent, you're no stranger to breaking down silos across departments and agencies. What's your final word for us today?
For those that are listening in, if you do what you've always done, you'll get what you've always gotten. Be brave, have courage, persevere, and progress. That's the whole idea. That's the whole idea behind our accreditation system. Is there may be failings, there may be areas that have voids, there may be areas that we need improvement on. Take that next step and utilize the resources that we've talked about and also that CASEL provides.
Thank you so much for that. Very much appreciate our collaborative partnership with Kansas as a STAR member of the Collaborating States Initiative with CASEL. And thank you, gentlemen, for your time today on behalf of Kansans who can succeed in school and career and beyond. Thank you.